Josephus was connected with people who knew Jesus. Josephus was a non-Christian. He was an eminent historian. But because he's very capable of dismissing supernatural claims, but he doesn't with Jesus. He does with other people, but not with Jesus. And when you evaluate the accounts historiographically and you cross-check them to see how accurate are they? Do they get their names, their dates, their events correct? Do they have incidental references and historical allusions for which the original audience wouldn't be able to check, but which we can check now? Are those accurate? And again and again and again, we find that they are accurate.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Justus Smith with Proverbs Media Group, and we're coming to you live from our Oro Valley headquarters. And today, I have a very special, esteemed guest that we've been waiting to bring on the show for some time now. Welcome, T.C Schmidt.
Thank you, Justus. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And if I may provide a little context to our viewers at home. Today we're joined by Dr. T.C Schmidt, a scholar with a PhD from Yale University, where he specialized in early Christianity, Greco-Roman history, and the Jewish world of the first century. His research has focused on bridging the gap between ancient texts and modern understanding. He's widely respected for his work on Josephus and the cultural backdrop of the New Testament. Dr. Schmidt is the author of Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. We'll provide a link as well for all of our viewers to go ahead and go pick up a copy of that book, a groundbreaking new study that explores the life, writings, and historical significance of Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian whose works remain some of the most important sources for understanding the world of Jesus and the early church. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Justice.
Absolutely. Well, let's get straight into it then. My first question to you is, the Josephus testimony dates to the last decade of the first century, which leaves an approximately 60-year gap between this and Christ's crucifixion. Do you think that further neutral, for example, non-gospel testimony of this sort might arise in the future from individuals who are more nearly contemporaneous with the event?
Interesting question, Justice. It's always possible. I think it would be unlikely. I'm not holding my breath, but it's definitely possible. We know that there were, Luke in his prologue says that many have undertaken to write accounts about the events that have happened among us, meaning the life and ministry of Jesus. So there's certainly stuff that was out there. We know, for instance, there are early Christians who quote some Greco-Roman writers whom we no longer have, but who mention certain things. I'm thinking especially of a guy named Thales, who wrote somewhere probably in the first century, and he talks about a strange, mysterious darkness that occurred that perhaps may be the darkness of the crucifixion. So there is possibilities, but it would take, quite some extraordinary archaeological find, or it would take some sort of digital archaeology, culling through databases and finding manuscripts that perhaps have already been long known but never properly understood.
Excellent. That's very insightful. Now, I personally have this kind of eccentric interest in decadent Victorian prose. If Josephus was alive today, whose prose or speech pattern would you liken the way that he would have written in his speech today, if he was talking to you and I?
That's a great question, Justice. I am not a master of Victorian prose, but I would say that very long-winded sentences is what we would be looking for. So someone who is a master of this in the English language is P.G. Wodehouse. He postdates, he was born in the Victorian era, I think, towards the very end of it. But his English goes on for just sentences or lines and lines and lines of a single sentence. That's how Josephus writes. I think, though, that P.G. Wodehouse is easier to understand. He's such a master of prose, so it's very intelligible, even though he goes on and on. Josephus can be very difficult to follow. There are sentences out there that you just scratch your head wondering what he's trying to say.
Brilliant. I appreciate that. You suggest that Josephus may have had contact with individuals who were involved in the trial that sentenced Christ to crucifixion. How confident are you that Josephus received information from persons at the trial of Christ? And do you think that there's additional evidence we could realistically obtain that would further support this idea?
I do. I am confident. I think it's very likely that he obtained information from such people. And that's because, as I show in my book, this is the environment Josephus was raised in. He was born in Jerusalem in the 30s of the first century. He was raised in Jerusalem in the 40s and 50s. He was from an aristocratic family that descended from high priests and kings. He was a priest himself. He was a Pharisee. He knew the head of the Sanhedrin. He knew multiple chief priests directly and multiple high priests. He knew the Herodian kings. He was extremely well connected. And I show that he has multiple connections with people whose names are mentioned in the New Testament. For example, he knows the son of Annas, the high priest who is at the trial of Jesus. He knows the son of Gamaliel, the head of the Sanhedrin, who almost surely was at the trial of Jesus. He probably knew some of these people directly. I show that his commander, Ananus II, was, I think, with a very high degree of probability at the trial of Jesus. And Josephus knew this man face to face. So, in fact, he says in his historical account of Jesus, Josephus says it was the first men, in Greek, the protoi, who had Jesus crucified. And then later on in Josephus's autobiography, he says repeatedly, I knew the first men. I knew them. So, you think that, well, if he says it was the first men who had Jesus crucified, and then 20 years later, he says, I knew the first men. And given his social position, we know that he's very well placed to actually have known such people. It makes sense that he would have known people at the trial of Jesus. So I think it's very probable that he knew people at the trial. In terms of further evidence, I think there's still stuff out there. I mean, one of the wonderful things about the field of history is you from an outsider perspective, it feels like everything's already said and done about the ancient past. The reality, though, is not true. There's new evidence that emerges. I do that in my book. I use new methods of inquiry using databases. I use forensic authorship analysis, these new disciplines that didn't exist, a generation or two ago. And these can reveal connections and new pieces of evidence that we hitherto did not have. I'm confident that there will be new material. And in fact, I'm working on what I hope to be a second edition of my book where I do present some of this new stuff that I just have inkling towards now, but that I think might be ready for publication in some years' time.
Fantastic and totally fascinating. I can't wait to see this second edition. I'm curious if you're familiar with Father Paul Ornetti's chronovisor. It's this kind of mythical device that was proclaimed to be a window into the ancient past where you could, glean images from what happened in our distant ancestry. Imagine you had access to the chronovisor briefly, and you could go and communicate with Josephus. What would you want to ask him directly?
I would want to ask, what did you hear about Jesus when you were in Jerusalem in the 30s, 40s, and 50s? When you were with people who knew the apostles, I mean, one thing I point out in my book is that Josephus knew multiple people who put the disciples of Jesus on trial. He knew his commander in the Jewish war with Rome had Jesus' brother executed. And his friend, Herod Agrippa II, the last king of the Jews, he's the Herod Agrippa where, if you read the book of Acts, he attends the trial of the Apostle Paul. And Josephus knows him. In fact, we have a letter that Herod Agrippa wrote to Josephus where he says, "My dearest friend, Josephus." So they were close friends. So I'd want to ask Josephus, what did they say about Jesus? What did they tell you about this man from Galilee who was working these miracles, who did all these things, who was crucified? I would love to hear what he has to say.
Oh, that's fantastic. I have a personal interest in intelligence research. I'm not sure how much you've dived into this, but if you had to do a ballpark estimate within like a standard deviation, what would you guess Josephus's IQ was roughly?
Honestly, I think it was off the charts. He was, a jack of all trades, but a master of some at the same time. So he was a Pharisee. He was a priest. His standing was of such impressive heights that at only the age of 25, he was commissioned to be a diplomat sent to Rome and met with the empress herself. He wrote 500,000 words in Greek, which was not his original language. So he mastered this very difficult language, wrote 500,000 words, went on to become one of the finest historians the ancient world ever produced. So I would say he was in the 150s, 160s, something like that. He had a very, very high intelligence.
Oh, that's very interesting. I appreciate that. Much of your case rests on the recontextualization of Josephus's words, showing how they were neutral in tone rather than biased, or in some sense conveying a cryptic pro-Christianity. What, if any, serious skeptical responses have there been to your approach and findings, and how do you plan on addressing these responses?
I have had, the book came out in the US just 4 weeks ago, but it was out in Europe 3 or 4 months ago. So there have been some critical responses. The vast majority have been very, very positive from both scholars and lay folks, and both scholars in my field and scholars in adjacent fields. But there have been some negative responses. Most of those, I think, have not understood my argument correctly. My argument is that Josephus is writing something that is neutral or ambiguous. It's not clearly positive. It's not clearly negative. And most critical responses have pointed out that some of the words and phrases that he says about Jesus, that I show elsewhere Josephus uses the same words and phrases in a negative way, these critical responses will point out areas where he uses them in a positive way. And my response to that is, that's my argument, that he uses these phrases both positively and negatively. So those have been most of the critical responses could be chalked up to that. There have been a few places. My book is 140,000 words. I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of footnotes. And in those footnotes, there's well over 1,000 citations. And so I make some mistakes. I miscite a few things here and there. Some scholars have written to me pointing this out. Fortunately, these are minor. If a second edition comes about, I just need to alter some things. They're not substantive to my argument, but they're still a little embarrassing. I wish I didn't make those flubs. So I'd go back and change those. Those are the main criticisms so far. I've been very pleased at the reception, and this is by people all over the spectrum in terms of, people of faith, secular people, conservative Christians, non-Christians. People have been very, very positive thus far.
Excellent. I'm a big fan of your work personally. There's a piece of content that we'll be releasing soon that I'll share with you before we put it out that actually reviews the contents of the book. And we make the argument that it's probably the greatest evidence of Jesus's life and the proof of the historicity of it, given that we have an unbiased source that is speaking of the man called Christ. So cheers to you for your fantastic work.
Thank you, Justus. I'd love to see that when you get a chance to finish it.
Certainly. The most popular contemporary skeptical arguments against Christianity that are based on the New Testament scholarship have aimed to cast doubt on the Gospels as offering first-hand testimony or as containing substantial historical reportage, favoring the idea that the supernatural accounts are later legendary embellishments from non-eyewitnesses. In light of the Josephine evidence, it appears that is highly unlikely, and that the core supernatural claims found in the Gospels were believed by the followers of Jesus from very early on. What sorts of arguments do you think skeptics would rely on if they had to accept that their key beliefs about Christ's miracles, resurrection, etc., aren't late emerging accretions?
Yes, in my book, one of the things I conclude is that this notion that the miracles of Jesus were somehow invented, generations or decades after the fact, doesn't cohere with the testimony of Josephus, where he, though not following Jesus, though perhaps skeptical, he admits that Jesus did work miracles. He worked some kind of supernatural deeds. And this is powerful in particular, not only because Josephus was connected with people who knew Jesus. Josephus was a non-Christian. He was an eminent historian, but because he's very capable of dismissing supernatural claims, but he doesn't with Jesus. He does with other people, but not with Jesus. As far as what I think the arguments would be for contemporary skeptics who are faced with this kind of evidence, I think that if they were to accept this evidence, I would point towards what skeptics or atheists or pagan authors said in the early centuries of the Christian movement. Then people had no problem with the supernatural. There were many authors that perfectly accepted the supernatural, but they embraced a polytheistic worldview where they believed that perhaps Jesus was a good guy, but kind of like Hercules, this demigod figure, just one of the pantheon. Another possibility is what some very hostile Jewish sources say about Jesus. I'm speaking of sources like the Toldoth Yeshu, which is this very critical biography of Jesus written from a Jewish perspective. I'm also thinking of a source called the Jew of Celsus, writing from the 2nd century. Again, viciously critical of Jesus. Both of them, though, admit that Jesus worked miracles, but they try to come up with explanations for this involving the occult, involving magic. They say that Jesus was like a sorcerer casting spells with the help of demons. This is by and large what the Gospels say Jesus' detractors said, that he's only casting out demons by Beelzebub, by the ruler of demons. So I think that in our pluralistic society where we see how materialism as a worldview is on the decline, that we will start seeing more arguments like this, where people are willing to accept the supernatural, but they don't think that that necessarily points to a divine origin. They think that there's all these intermediary, potentially malevolent spirits that could be doing similar things.
Fascinating. I have also a great interest in psychical and anomalistic research. Have you ever personally experienced anything supernatural or miraculous?
I have, actually, Justus, more than once.
Wow.
I think that, I was born with a very serious heart defect, and I've had open heart surgeries, a couple of them, and I always had this terrible, terrible pain whenever I would go running. My whole life, up till I was about 18 years old. And I would beg God to heal me, and he never did. I was very embittered against God for this. I'm thinking, if you really are all powerful and all good, how come you're not healing me when I'm suffering like this? And when I was 18, I became a Christian. I was convicted of my sins. And I was actually convicted that God had given me this life that I had hated him for instead of being grateful for. And I told, Lord, I'm sorry that I haven't been grateful for the life you've given to me. And a few days later, I realized that that pain that I always had whenever I would go running was gone. And that was 24 years ago, and it still isn't back. And I can run more now than I could when I was 18 years old without that pain. So I still have a heart defect, I still go to the doctor regularly. So for me, this idea that miracles can't happen, I've never thought that was a good argument. What are miracles, other than things that are observed historically? What are the laws of physics than just the patterns we observe historically? We have these patterns we observe historically, and we call them physical laws, I think appropriately. But miracles are also something observed historically, and they should be part of the historical record, just like our catalog of data, showing these physical laws should also be considered in that light.
Amen, brother. That is fascinating. I really appreciate you sharing that with me. And that gives me a little more insight. I am curious what motivated you and inspired you to begin the work of this book.
Of course, I've always been interested in the person of Jesus, as you can hear from my personal story. And I started researching this because I was at a PhD seminar. I was a PhD student at Yale University on the historical Jesus. We had to pick a topic. I was studying Arabic and Syriac, and I'm trying to figure out how to. Those two languages usually don't go with historical Jesus study because they exist on the historical record after Jesus. But I knew that there were Arabic and Syriac versions of Josephus's testimony about Jesus, and that some scholars have thought that these were more authentic than the Greek original. So I thought, I'll write a paper on this. I, at the time, accepted the scholarly view that the Greek version had been changed by later Christian scribes. And so I wrote about the Arabic and Syriac version in my paper. And then I thought I found some interesting stuff, so I tried to publish it, but it was too long. It was like 70 pages, too long for a journal article. So I decided to turn it into a book, and I did more and more research. And that research slowly convinced me that this passage was authentic. So I was led to this by the evidence. And I will say this, that one of the great mistakes that many people make, this is Christians, this is non-Christians, this is atheists, whoever, is that they will constantly try to dismiss someone's beliefs or their arguments based on that person's beliefs. And I think that when we're talking about scholarly inquiry, we should always look at the evidence. We should not commit the fallacy of motivationalism, because otherwise I could say the same thing about any atheist arguments. Any atheist arguments, I could say, well, I'm not even going to assess the validity of that argument because it's coming from an atheist, and of course they would want to believe this. So I'll dismiss it. It's the same thing that atheists do to Christians sometimes when they say, well, this person's a Christian, so I'm not going to investigate the evidence they present. I think it's very important to look at the evidence fairly and to follow it wherever it leads. And as a Christian, I believe that I have a duty to the truth, even if I don't like it. If the evidence shows that what Josephus said had been distorted by later Christian scribes, then I've got to throw it out. That's what the evidence reveals. If that's the truth, that's the truth. End of discussion. So
certainly,
I was led down this path originally. It was foisted on me in a Yale PhD seminar, and then I got interested in it. I wanted to do something on the Syriac and Arabic versions of the Testimonium Flavianum, this passage about Jesus in the works of Josephus. And one thing led to another, and I started leveraging new research techniques using databases and things like that. And just step after step after step, I started realizing all these arguments against the passage don't have merit. And hence, that's why I came to the conclusions I did in my book.
That is incredible. I appreciate you sharing that background. Although I completely condemn and disagree with the lifestyle choices of Aleister Crowley, he had a quote that somewhat echoes what you've shared in sentiment. He said that the God of your enemy is the devil of your religion. And it kind of speaks to the idea of condemning other worldviews and not taking their evidence in with at least some degree of consideration.
Yeah.
Now, I'll need your... Oh, please.
I was going to say that I think that's on point, what you extrapolated from that quote, that Christians should not be afraid of other people's perspectives, other religious worldviews, secular worldviews, because if it's true that Christianity is true, if that's the case, then we should never be threatened by such things. To be threatened is to sort of admit that you're worried that perhaps what you follow isn't true. And I found that, Yale University is a secular university. It can sometimes be extremely hostile to the Christian faith. I was very much challenged by folks there, professors and my colleagues and doctoral students, because of my beliefs. My beliefs, though, I think were sharpened being there. And that, I think, is also another perspective where not only should we follow where the evidence leads, but it means that we should be willing to listen to the arguments of others. and take those ideas seriously with confidence, knowing that if we really do believe in the truth, then those arguments, if they have kernels of truth in them, will only serve to enrich our own worldviews.
Absolutely. Completely agree. I'm not a great historian here, so please help me out. But I understand Alfonso X was raiding Toledo with his troops. And typically what a lot of kings would do during the period was burn the libraries of your enemies after conquering their land, as to say that their wisdom holds no value. But Toledo is, Alfonso X was a bit of like an scholarly alchemist, kind of esoteric, very scholarly minded person. And instead he had all of these Arabic texts translated into Latin so that he may read them. And he kept all the good stuff and kind of disseminated the other stuff. And once he finished the good stuff, he'd share it with others. But I understand that he discovered that almost the entire, what we have today as the bulk of the Greek canon, was mostly preserved and saved in final copy in that library in Toledo by Alfonso X. Can you speak to that?
I've not heard that specific story before. I'll have to check that out. I think it can be largely said that the canon of Greek literature that we have in the West was passed down to us at various points from these Arabic manuscripts, especially some scientific and medical works and philosophical works, like from Aristotle. But there is a very important but here. That neglects to consider that Christianity was far more than Western Europe. Christianity was all over Eastern Europe and the Middle East. So those Greek works, of course, never left Byzantium. They were always in Eastern Europe. Aristotle was always read amongst Eastern Christians until Constantinople fell, and even after the fall of Constantinople in the 1400s. And Aristotle was read and translated by Middle Eastern Christians writing in Syriac and Arabic. And we have Aristotle in Syriac and in Arabic made by Christians, and the same goes for scientific and medical literature. So in a sense, you could say that the Greek classics were rescued via, Islamic hands in Spain and Portugal and places like that. But that's only true for Western Christendom. For Eastern Christians, actually, that's not the case, where those works were always preserved, were always passed down. And I think that's something very important to remember, that this idea that there was this sort of dark age where Christians just threw out a bunch of the ancient Roman and Greek learning, is not fair. That's not accurate. Certainly if you go to Great Britain in the 400s and 500s, it's going to look a lot less civilized than if you had been there 200 years earlier when the Romans were there. But remember that the Romans were only there writing in Latin. It's not like Aristotle was all over Great Britain in the 200s or 300s. So eventually he makes it there, and Greek scientific works make it there. But if you go to other places in the Eastern Empire and in the Middle East, you'll always find these scientific works being promoted by Christians continuously.
Oh, wow. Well, I appreciate the clarification. That helps a good bit. Atheists often argue that the choice of religion is intellectually arbitrary, and that any given religion is as likely to be true as any other. Some Christians reply that their religion is largely unique in offering a specific history of miraculous events that can be investigated and found credible, giving Christianity greater rational warrant than other faiths. Do you think Christians have good grounds for this argument? And are there other evidences that support it apart from that from Josephus that you have found particularly compelling?
Of course, I think that the evidence does support Christianity. I'm a Christian myself. And I do think there's very good historical warrant for believing in the miracles that are described in the gospel accounts. It's very easy to look at the four gospels and think, well, that's just part of the Bible. But remember that when the gospels were written, the New Testament didn't exist. These were just accounts of Jesus's life that were written by his disciples or by their disciples. And in that sense, we should We should analyze them like we would any other ancient text, any other ancient biography written about someone, whether it's Socrates or Plato or one of the Roman emperors or Alexander the Great or someone like that. And when you look at the four Gospels in this light, what's astonishing is that we have four of them. This is simply unparalleled. I mean, you can line up all of the kings and emperors who ever lived in antiquity anywhere, and you will find maybe two or three that have four different accounts of their lives that were written within 40 or 50 years of their death, and maybe not even that, depending how you count. And here we have a Jewish rabbi from Galilee who was crucified at the behest of the Romans, and we've got these four different accounts. And when you evaluate the accounts historiographically and you cross-check them to see how accurate are they? Do they get their names, their dates, their events correct? Do they have incidental references and historical allusions for which the original audience wouldn't be able to check, but which we can check now? Are those accurate? And again and again and again, we find that they are accurate. And this is shown in multiple ways. Scholars used to say, for instance, that the figure Nicodemus in the Gospel of John was made up by John. He never existed. His name means ruler of the people, and he's just an allegory for Jesus persuading the rulers of the people, et cetera, et cetera. But, then Richard Bauckham comes along, a famous scholar, and he describes how actually, if you look at Nicodemus in the Gospels, he's described as a very wealthy a teacher of the law who's a Pharisee, and there's several other points that are described about him. And if you look at the historical record in the writings of Josephus and the writings of the Jewish Talmud, we find that there's really only one Jewish family that matches that kind of description. And one of the most common names for men in that family was Nicodemus. And in fact, Nicodemus is an extraordinarily rare name that seems only associated with that family. So it does seem like Nicodemus was a historical person. And John, the writer of his gospel, was right. And we see this again and again with various discoveries. Not only that, the authors had much to lose with saying these things about Jesus. We know that they suffered immensely for their claims. They put a lot on the line, and some of them, like the Apostle Paul, was a skeptic. It's actually not fair to say that Josephus is our only first century non-Christian account about Jesus, because before Paul was Paul the Apostle and he was Saul of Tarsus, he was a hostile figure towards Jesus. He was persecuting the enemies of Jesus. And then he tells us in his own words that Jesus appeared to him, and Saul repented and became a follower of Christ and started writing about it. So here we have yet another, a fifth source outside of the four Gospels from a first century Jewish Pharisee who says, I doubted. I did not think this account was true, but then I was a violent man, he says. But then Jesus appeared to me. This is really unparalleled in human history and on the historical record. So I do think there are very good grounds to place Christian faith on the historical record. I would say, though, that if I would recommend that if someone is thinking about following Christ, they're not sure about the gospel message, they understand the historical argument, perhaps it's not just enough, or perhaps it's too much work to do the research, then I would follow the course of action recommended by Jesus in the Gospel of John. Jesus says that if you want to know whether my words are true, then do what I say, and then you'll know. And Jesus talks about repenting of your sins and turning to him, and then you'll know that his words are true. And I would recommend that to any readers who are thinking of following Jesus and are at that cusp of deciding.
Amen, brother. That is brilliantly put. One of my final questions for you, non-related to the book. You're a Yale man. Did you ever get tapped for Skull and Bones?
No, I've seen where they meet, but No, I have not. I was not tapped. I think that's just an undergrad thing too. I was a grad student.
Ah, hmm.
But yeah, if you're in New Haven, you'll see these like mysterious, locations without windows, these buildings, these windowless places that apparently have very high water bills, and for some reason, and that's where they do all their stuff in there. But no, I've never been inside. I've seen where they're located.
Well, that's fantastic. Dr. Schmidt, we appreciate you so much for coming on the show. You are brilliant. Your findings are groundbreaking. And I encourage everyone at home to go pick up a copy of your new book. We'll have links in the bio, hopefully something clickable on the screen. Is there any shout outs you'd like to give, any credits you'd like to offer, any thanks to the world?
Yes. One, I would say to your readers and your viewers and your listeners that they can get a free copy of the book at the book website. It's josephusandjesus.com, and this was made freely available by a very generous donor. They can also purchase a copy. The book is priced for academics and libraries, so it's pretty pricey. So if that's too much, go get the free digital copy on the book website. There's unlimited numbers, so there's no restrictions. You can send it along to your friends. And this was in part made possible by a very generous donor, and it's also being facilitated. The book's promotion is being facilitated by this Institute for Christian Reflection, which I'm part of. And the Institute is hoping to raise money to make more discoveries like what this book presents. I'm part of this. I've got several other discoveries lined up. So if you would like to support that, go to the Institute website. You can find that linked on the book website, but you can just also go to the Institute for Christian Reflection.com or .org. I forget which.
We'll make sure it's in the bio. Thank you so much for your time. God bless you, brother, and I hope that we can stay in touch.
Me too, Justus. Thank you, and God bless.
God bless you.